My name is David Lednicer, and this is a talk on the air racing aircraft of the National Air Races, talking about design modifications and performance, and then, of course, I also added a little bit more to that. This is the second in the series, following Mike Lavelle's talk, and Barry Latter will be following. This talk was originally given in 2016, if I remember right, so it's a reprise of it. Hopefully I can remember everything. So anyways, we're going to look at several different types of races that were held. And this is, of course, in the time period of the Historic Flight Foundation, 1927, 1957, our focus years. So you can see that these actually overlap outside of that range a little bit. The original races, of course, were the Bendix Trophy races starting in 1909 that ran through 1920, sponsored by the newspaperman Gordon Bennett. And then they were followed by the Pulitzer Trophy races from 1920 to 1925. Once again, just slightly out of our period, but they were important in the lead up to all this. And in parallel, in Europe, there was the Schneider Cup Trophy races. There were seaplane races, started in 1913, went through 1931, when the trophy was permanently retired because it was won 3 times in a row. And then finally, down below that, the Thompson Trophy races, the closed course races from 1929 really through 1949, though in name they were held through 1961, but the trophy was really given for other things in that period. And then, of course, the Reno Air Races, the National Air Races as we know them today, followed on pretty much from the Thompson Trophy races in concept. Of course, Thompson races were held in Cleveland, while Reno is Reno, Nevada. So, and Thompson being Thompson Products, aircraft equipment manufacturer, who later merged with Ramo Wildridge, former Hughes aircraft employees, to form TRW, which I think TRW is part of Boeing now, if I remember right. Yeah, so anyways, but that's how the linkage works in that regard. Anyways, there were also cross-country races. The Bendix Trophy race from 1931, once again, really through 1949, and then the military kind of subverted it or co-opted it beyond that until 1962. And that was a coast-to-coast air race sponsored by Bendix, which is the another aircraft component manufacturing company, headquartered in South Bend, Indiana. And then the Women's Air Derby was held in 1929, which is kind of the women's parallel race. But as we'll see, later on, the Bendix race effectively became co-ed, and women won it several years. So yeah, there wasn't really a need for the Women's Air Derby after that point. And then lastly, we'll make mention of the MacRobertson air race in 1934 from the UK to Australia. And there were other races. In fact, one just recently I came across, gosh, I can't remember the name of it all of a sudden, but it was a race from the UK to South Africa. And unfortunately, the British only allowed British-made aircraft into it. Because of that, it kind of got lost to history. So anyways, airframe construction. A lot evolution in this regard happened during the period of these races and was seen in the racers themselves. Most airplanes started out in design as space frames over there on the left. And the idea with air was there was an internal truss structure and there was a skin put over it, but the skin was mainly just to provide cover. In fact, theoretically, the airplanes could be flown with just a wing cover on. You didn't really need the fuselage cover. And the loads were all then taken through the truss structure. And then what that evolved to, though, when structural analysts started realizing what could be done, were the semi-monocoque and then fully monocoque constructions. And in these cases, the loads were either carried partly or totally by the skin. And you had, in the case of semi-monocoque, you had bulkheads, stringers, formers, and then the skin itself. And the analysis actually was conducted with just the internal members carrying this load, but in reality, the skin carried load too. So the evolution was from space frame towards monocoque in this time period. So why use monocoque, really, which is a perfectly valid question. And space frames were initially adapted because they were easier to design and easier to analyze for strength. It was actually a very simple analysis. But the trouble is, space frames are kind of heavy, as the skin is just kind of along for the ride and is a weight that isn't really doing its fair share. And then, of course, you also end up with bracing externally, usually, that created a lot of drag. Witness the Curtis Jenny down there in the lower left, classic example of a space frame. The monocoque is more difficult to analyze because now you have shell carrying loads, and there were theories for doing that. I remember learning them in college, but nowadays with finite element analyses, it's a lot easier to analyze monocoque or semi-monocoque. But anyways, if it's designed properly, it can be much lighter and can have lower drag. And the Dieppe-Dressen monocoque shown there on the lower right is a good example of that. And that airplane is only removed from the Curtiss Jenny by a couple of years. So in that case, the engineers in France were well ahead of the game, establishing this method of construction. Though the Dieppe-Dressen is wood, and as we'll get to later, other people pioneered metal monocoque construction. So anyways, state of the art in 1920 for the Pulitzer Trophy race in the United States was this Verraville Packard racer. It was built from an existing fighter airplane or pursuit airplane that built for U.S. Army Air Corps. And it was all wood monocoque fuselage, wood and fabric wings. So the fuselage is monocoque wood, in other words, a shell, but the wings themselves are more conventional spar, ribs, and fabric covering. And it was rather underpowered, I would take, from its winning speed of only 156 miles an hour. So that's one thing to kind of keep an eye on as we go along, is the winning speeds for these aircraft. You'll see them consistently climbing as the time went on. So anyways, for 1921 and 1923, the Pulitzer Trophy races and the 1923 Schneider Cup Trophy race were all won by Curtiss CR-1 and CR-3 airplanes. And these once again had a wood monocoque fuselage, wood and fabric wings. So they were partway along the evolutionary line in terms of structure. And as you can see, as far as the land planes, they were consistently winning at higher and higher speeds. Of course, the float plane with all the drag of the floats was credited with a much lower speed. By 1924, the very next year in this progression, we had the Verraville Sperry R3 racer, which at this point, we have a much more modern design where the wings, you might notice, have no external bracing. And it's got a space frame fuselage, which is a bit of a retrograde step, but the wings themselves are cantilever with internal structure. So much more sophisticated design. And in fact, in the lower left area, you can actually see the guts of the wing or the fuselage construction with the space frame. And once again, speeds are going up. We're credited with speed now at 215 miles an hour. So it's gaining sophistication and design. 1929 was a real watershed. This is when the Travailleur Mystery R racers showed up for the races. And this had been designed by Walter Beech. Travailleur went bust, and then Walter Beech founded another company, Beech, which is the Beechcraft we know today, more or less. In fact, Walter Beech died in the 50s, and his wife, Olive Ann, ran the company. In fact, I stood behind her at the first flight of the Starship. So she was still active in the company into, gosh, the early 80s, if I remember right. Anyways, the Travailleur Mystery R benefited from a very, very slick design. It did have external bracing, as you can see there. And it had a steel space frame fuselage and wood wings and a wood covered fuselage, but it was much cleaner design. And it was powered by Wright Whirlwind, Wright's new product for a radial engine. And it was credited with a winning speed of 194 miles an hour. As you can see, it's less than the Verraville Sperry racer, but the Travailleur Mystery R was actually capable of higher speeds. And it was, as I say, a very slick design in its time. Probably suffered a little bit on the weight side. And by the way, this is a replica that was built by Jim Youngin, if I remember right. It was at Oshkosh, 1978, if I remember right. And it's in a museum, I think, Tennessee, or Arkansas right now, if I remember right. So anyways, the next year, 1930 Thompson Trophy, we get a bit of a retrograde step again, where Matty Laird's design of the solution, we go back to fabric and metal covered, metal being the front, some of the front area there, and space frame fuselage, wood fabric wings, but we're seeing a little bit more speed here. We're up to 201 miles an hour, though we do have another 135 horsepower in a Wright R985, one of the first race applications of the Pratt engines. And the following years, though, we get into the GBs. And these were the Granville brothers out of Springfield, Massachusetts. And the construction of these were, as I say, steel space frame, fabric covered, wooden fabric wings. You can see the external bracing. but they were designed for the minimum wetted area. So they were very fast. In fact, if you look at the speeds there, you can see 236 for the Model Z from 1931 and 252 miles an hour for the Model R1 from the next year in the Thompson Trophy race. Both of these aircraft you see here, though, are replicas. The original Z was lost in a crash in Detroit in 1932 during an attempt for a world speed record, and the R1 went through a series of mishaps, let's put it that way, before it was finally destroyed. So the one you see there is a replica that's in the New England Air Museum in Hartford, and the upper left, that GB Model Z. That's down the Museum of Flight in Seattle. That was a replica built by I can't remember the guy's first name. He built it for Tom Wathen. It was one of the original replica racers that was built down in Flabob. So the next year, 33 and 34 were dominated by the Wheatle-Williams aircraft, Wheatle-Williams Ford Model 44s. And there were a number of these actually built, and as you can see, speed-wise, if you go back, we go backwards a step, you can see they're slower than the R1 by a little bit. The R1 might very well have beaten them if they could have survived their mishaps. They were a little bit more, they were same method of construction, space frame, wood wings and stuff. They were a little cruder aerodynamically from what I've found out. Jimmy Wheatle, who designed them, wasn't as knowledgeable in aerodynamics as the folks that designed the Model Z and the Model R1. In fact, the Model Z was actually designed by Bob Hall, who later went to Grumman and was test pilot there and heavily involved in the design of many aircraft, including the Bearcat. So we have the Wheatle-Williams through 1934, and then after 35 and 36, there were several other racers we'll get to later. 38 and 39 were the kind of the pinnacle for the Thompson Trophy, or pre-war Thompson Trophy races, where we had an aircraft originally designed by Brown that Matty Laird was given and told to fix. And he, working with Roscoe Turner, developed it as the Meteor. And it's, once again, fabric covered steel space frame, wood wings, but a very clean design. And you can see that it was capable of rather good speeds, though it did have 1,000 horsepower on the front end. And that aircraft right there is in the Udvar-Hazy Center at the National Air and Space Museum out of Dulles Airport. Thankfully, it survived without any mishaps. I think it got burned, the fabric got burned off it in the fire one year, but that was about it in its history. So if you look at it, the Pulitzer, the National Air Races, and the Thompson Trophy races before the war were never won by an aircraft of metal construction, or monocoque construction. But there was a different trend going on with Schneider and Bendix Trophy races, strangely enough. Despite the fact even the Bendix was tightly tied into the Thompson race, quite often with the aircraft from the Thompson race participating in the Bendix race and vice versa. All metal monocoque aircraft really were born by Dornier, working with Zeppelin in 1918, developed the first aluminum stress skin monocoque fuselage and wings. And it's this aircraft right here. And you can see in the cutaway on the lower left, very modern type of construction, multi-spar wing, metal ribs, metal skin, and the fuselage on the right there, once again, something we could very well see in an aircraft of this era. So he was quite forward-looking in what he pioneered in his design there. But the thing is, despite the fact that he could do it, it wasn't necessarily universally adopted. So we get into the Schneider Cup Trophy races, which, as I say, started in 1913, but let's pick it up in 1925. And at that point, the Curtiss R3C2 won in 1925. Once again, wood monocoque fuselage, wooden fabric wings. And if you hark back to the Pulitzer races I showed you earlier, this very same airplane had the floats taken off and gear put on, and it won the Pulitzer race the very same year. So in that case, it was a very adaptable airplane. It was flown by Jimmy Doolittle when it won the Schneider Cup Trophy race. And there in the National Air and Space Museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Now, to take home, so to say, or retire the Schneider Cup Trophy, a country had to win the trophy 3 times in a row. And the well, actually, I think 3 times. I don't think it even had to be in a row, if I remember right. The United States ended up winning it twice, but we never fielded a team really that could do it 3rd time around, so we missed our chance. The Italians actually won in 1926 with the Mach-E M39 in the lower right, Very similar sort of design, a bit faster, obviously. And then they actually went ahead and won another time on. So they actually had 2 races to their credit. So the British realized they had to do something, and because the Italians were their great rivals. So in 1927, R.J. Mitchell had designed the Supermarine S5 that you see there. It's all aluminum stress skin monocoque, very modern type of construction. And it won the Schneider Cup trophy that year in 1927. So because of that, the trophy race the next year was held in the UK, and in that year, the Supermarine S6 won, which was a follow-on with a bigger engine, a Rolls-Royce R engine. And then finally in 1931, the Italians weren't able to get their design together in time, and the British then ran timed circuits of the course to win again and retire the trophy. And in fact, the Schneider Cup trophy is now in the South Kensington Science Museum in London, along with the Supermarine S6B. And as you can see there, it's a very modern design. It influenced a lot of the thinking, as we'll see, that led to the Spitfire. And the engine, the Rolls-Royce R, led directly to the Griffin engine that was used in later models of the Spitfire and other aircraft. So, as I say, we have John Spitfire here. There was a great direct descendant of the S5, S6, and S6B. In fact, you can see a lot of similarity in the lines even of the aircraft. Both, all being R.J. Mitchell designs. What might have been was what the Italians were trying to get together in 1931 was the Mach-E M72. And it has a 3,000 horsepower Fiat engine in it, but really it's got 2 1,500 horsepower engines that are coupled together. And each one drives a different propeller there on the front for the counter-rotating propellers. And it took a lot of development work. They had a lot of problems with the induction system and backfiring and stuff. They finally had to hire the Rolls-Royce fuel expert, Rod Banks, who came in and made some recommendations, including lengthening the inlet ducting to get it right up behind the prop. That finally got everything working right. And it was flown on Lake Como. That's it, Lake Como. And it set a speed record of 440.7 miles an hour for seaplanes, which still stands. And actually was the absolute world speed record for aircraft for a while too, until finally land planes became fast enough to beat it. It's a very modern, slick design. Obviously, it's got bracing, which is not an advantage, but they did things like you can see the cooling units on the floats, and also the wing participate in the cooling of the engine. And it was a very, very slick design. It's actually one of my favorite airplanes. So the Bendix Trophy races, being cross-country races, they had been won by Thompson Trophy racer type aircraft, like the GBR2 in earlier years. But in 1935, Benny Howard came forth with the airplane you see on the upper left there, Mr. Mulligan, and a very, I don't know what you call it, general aviation looking airplane. Space frame fuselage, wooden fabric wings, so kind of retrograde step in some ways. But he was able to win the race. It was basically from the West Coast to Cleveland with an average speed of 238 miles an hour. And then Harold Newman turned around and actually flew the same airplane in the Thompson Trophy race that year and won the race. So it was a very, very fast airplane. Unfortunately, it was lost the very next year when Benny and his wife were participating in the Bendix Trophy race in an engine failure over Arizona. And they put it down. They survived. He lost a leg. And the wreckage actually sat there for quite a while until someone finally in the 1970s went out and recovered some of it and actually rebuilt the airplane, and unfortunately crashed it while trying to set a speed record. And lower right there was the winner of 1936 of the Bendix Trophy race, H. Staggerwing, just like, well, the same basic design as the one here at the Historic Flight Foundation. Blanche Noyes and Louise Thaden flew it coast to coast and won the race, actually to their own surprise, when they didn't realize they were the fastest airplane and they were going to win. So as I say, the Bendix race right off took on a very co-ed nature in that regard. In 1937, 38, 39 then, though, the Bendix race was won by Seversky SEV-2 aircraft. They're all aluminum stress skin monocoque. Looks a lot like a World War II fighter in that regard. Jacqueline Cochran, seen there in the cockpit, won 1 year, and then I want to say Frank Sinclair, if I remember right, won the other 2 years with slightly modified aircraft. The gear didn't retract quite the same on his. But as you can see, they make a big step forward here in terms of design. And the speeds you can see here, you can see in 1939, the winning speed coast to coast was 282 miles an hour. And that's right up there with the winning speed of Roscoe Turner in the closed course Thompson Trophy race that year. So as you can imagine, SEV-2S was a very fast airplane, but it didn't really do that well in the closed course races. And of course, the SEV-2, you take one look at it, it's Alexander Cart Valley design for Seversky. Seversky becoming Republic after Seversky out of the company. And it became first the P-41, the P-43, and then finally the P-47. And that's from the Flying Heritage and Collection and Armor Museum over across Payne Field. And they're beautiful P-47. As I understand it, they even have the turbocharger hooked up in it, which is, this aircraft's got a huge turbocharger in the rear end of the fuselage, which is why it's so deep compared to, say, the more svelte P-35 here or SEV-2. Anyways, and as I note, all aluminum stress skin monocoque. So no other notable all-metal airplanes of the era. Jack Northrop, who of course obviously we know his name today, was actually one of the pioneers in the U.S. in terms of all-metal construction and design. His first design, first well-known design was Northrop Alpha, seen up there in the upper left, which was a mail plane used in the United States, TWA and other airlines. And that example right there is the very last one left, and it's now in the National Air and Space Museum, DC, found in a barn, Wisconsin, if I remember right, restored. And that led to the Northrop Gamma in the lower right corner there, which was faster, bigger aircraft. More of them were built, but what you see right there is the only survivor. And once again, it's the National Air and Space Museum on the Mall in DC. The Alpha was never raced. The Gamma was raced several times in the Bendix, including by Jacqueline Cochran, but never did that well. It was often misfortune that caused it not to really do that well. The 1934 MacRobertson race was actually a very interesting saga. De Havilland built 3 all-wood monocoque airframes called the Comet, the DH-88 Comet, powered by relatively small engines. And in the end, they placed first and fourth, and then the third one dropped out. It was flown by the Morrisons. And funny enough, the race was so long, there were multiple fuel stops, so larger aircraft like the DC-2 could do very well. And actually, there, as you see it, DC-2 placed in second in the race. Aluminum, semi-monocoque airframe, just like we see in the DC-3 there at the Historic Flight Foundation. And there on the right is the Boeing 247D, which was kind of Boeing's pre-competitor to the DC-2. And Roscoe Turner and Clyde Pangborn flew it to third place in the MacRobertson race. And there are a number of 247s left. And that one right there is also in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. on the Mall. And as you note, it's actually hung down below the DC-3 appropriately, which is the airplane that knocked it out of the airliner business. The Comet, though, led directly to the de Havilland Mosquito. Very similar construction, very similar ideas aerodynamically. So it had a real positive outcome, so to say. Interesting enough, of the Comets, that one right there is at the Shuttleworth collection in the UK and is still flown. I think the Morrisons one still exists too. And then there's a replica now that was built at Playbob that is flown a bit, once again from Tom Wathen's collection. Anyways, if we look at the trends and increases in speed, we've noticed that the civil aircraft were quite a bit faster than the military aircraft of these eras. And what happened was the military aircraft had armor and armament that was kind of weight that wasn't really buying them much for speed, though obviously it was mission critical to have it. So for that reason, the civil aircraft of the period were much higher performers than the military aircraft, kind of to the chagrin of the military. They didn't necessarily like that. And obviously that changed later on in the going. There were a lot of advances made on these airplanes in terms of reduction in drag. So if you compare the variable Packard, the Berryville Sperry, and then finally the Seversky aircraft here. You can see that the external bracing has been removed, the retractable landing gear has been implemented, and then finally we have an enclosed cockpit, better wing airfoils, and a reduction in cooling drag. So there were a lot of steps made in those regard that carried over into other areas in aviation. If you look at drag, drag is really a sum of two parts. One is a parasitic drag, which is just the drag caused by the air traveling around the object, caused by skin friction, aerodynamic interference, excrescences, cooling drag, things like that. And then you have a lift-induced drag, which is dependent on wingspan. Increasing the span reduces the induced drag. So these were understood to a degree at that time. And obviously what you see going on here, by and large, is reductions in parasitic drag because of all the cleanups that were done. If we look at a comparison of drag, and once again, we're looking at drag in terms of zero lift drag. In other words, we're not including the induced drag. These are the drags that I've been able to accumulate of all these different aircraft from these different periods. And obviously, the DC-2 and the Boeing 247 are rather large aircraft, so they stick out like a sore thumb. But otherwise, you see that the racing aircraft of the era had rather good drag and low drag, and it was steadily declining over a period of time. And then you can see it compared to modern aircraft like the Spitfire and the Mustang over there on the right, and then further over, Rare Bear, the Bearcat that races at Reno, Nemesis Formula One racer, and then a Beech A36 for comparison. You can see a Beech A36 zero lift drag actually is about equivalent to a lot of the racers. And obviously, it depends on what engine you have in your A36, but it's actually a pretty decent airplane in that regard. Wing airfoils were a big area of development through this period. The original Curtiss racers had a CR1 wing airfoil, you see on the upper left there. And as airfoils became better understood, you get airfoils like the Seversky wing airfoil on the upper right there with lower drag. And then one of the other advances was higher maximum lifts. In other words, allowing you lower stall speeds, lower landing speeds, lower takeoff speeds. And that's where you go with the Lockheed P-38 wing airfoil. That's a NACA designed airfoil. And then finally, the final step was when you get to the P-51 there on the lower left, which was a collaboration between North American and NACA to produce yet a lower drag airfoil. So yeah, the P-51 of those aircraft is, in a sense, the ultimate low drag airfoil. Air-cooled engine drag reduction a lot was done there. We see here on this Travel Mystery R replica, which is actually out of the Kalamazoo Air Zoo in Kalamazoo, Michigan, town where I grew up. Is you can see there's the cowling is a full-length NACA cowling, as we call it, and that was developed by Fred Weick at NACA. And the idea being there that the air entering through the front inlet was slowed down, diffused, and passed through the duct or the passages between the cylinder fins for cooling, and then reaccelerated out the back through a narrow slot. And it ended up with much lower drag than the old way of hanging cylinders out in the breeze or even putting a town end ring around them. So that was a major advance, and of course that ended up on a lot of aircraft after that. But the Travel Air Mystery R was one of the very first to make use of that. If we look at later use, we see such things as the Corsair on the upper left there. It's, once again, Museum of Flight, and that's the one recovered out of Lake Washington. And then the lower right, that's a Connie, and you can see very close cowled right R-3350s on that. And that's at the Fantasy of Flight down in Lakeland, Florida. Liquid cooled engine, there were a lot of advances made, especially with racing airplanes, also for drag reduction. You can see on the upper left there, some of the early radiator designs just had the radiators hanging out in the breeze because people didn't know what to do with them. But you can see, at least in that case, whoever designed that one knew the idea that you needed surface area to get cooling. And you can see that they do have a finned heat exchanger, which is good. On the Supermarine S6B on the lower right, you can see how they tried surface cooling. And the idea there was a much lower drag solution. The problem is they don't really have the surface area they need to discharge the heat that has to be rejected. So they were problematic at best. And the cutaway over on the lower left there is actually the cooling system used on the Mach-E MC-72. Gives you an idea of what was involved. And obviously, you can't use this on a combat aircraft because one bullet through the wing and boom, your whole heating system is leaking, or cooling system is leaking. I'm sorry. So something had to be done to get the drag of liquid-cooled installations down, and that finally was developed for World War II fighters. And that's the idea of an integrated radiator, either like on the Spitfire underneath the wing, or the P-51 in the lower right for a radiator tucked up inside the fuselage with a ducting system that's been optimized. Other solutions were like the Focke-Wulf 190 D9 in the upper right, where they had a ring radiator right behind the spinner inside the cowling, and the Mach-E 202 on the lower left, where they have it slung in a tray, kind of like the Spitfire down underneath the fuselage. In a lot of ways, the Mustang system was kind of the ultimate one, though. The wetted area of the airframe is a big driver in the overall drag of the aircraft. And one of the things that the Granville brothers did, especially Zanford Granville, in designing the GB was try to minimize the amount of area that was wetted by the flow. And for that reason, it has such a short fuselage. That was the whole concept, was basically tuck as much as possible behind a Pratt & Whitney R1340 and keep the wetted area down. And they got a very good speed out of it. But Caudron, the airplane that won the National Air Races in the US in 1936, a French design, they accomplished lower wetted area by just plainly a much smaller airframe. And they did it with a much smaller engine too. And as you can see with the speeds, because the drag was so much lower, they got much better speed out of the airframe. And as I note there, drag is proportional to wetted area. So by cutting the wetted area way down on that Caudron, that's how they got their speed. And the Caudron raced just in 1936 in the US. And then the American pilots didn't like the idea of a foreign aircraft coming in and winning. So they were kind of discouraged from coming over anymore. As far as airframe drag reduction, here's a good example. Both of these aircraft you see here are powered by a Curtiss D12, which is about 485 horsepower. So if you have a fairly draggy biplane in the upper left there, that Curtiss, and you can see it's got the radiators hanging out the breeze and everything. You got speeds anywhere from 176 through 243 miles an hour in different races it was in. Well, Steve Whitman, a school teacher from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, designed the Whitman D12 Bonzo on the lower right there, the red airplane, and 1935 around the same engine, but very tightly designed around the engine, and actually achieved speeds of like 325 miles an hour, significant advance in speed. And he actually led the National Air Races in the Thompson Trophy race several times. And one time he hit a bird and had other mishaps happen the cost of victory, though he came very close to actually winning. And of course, if you ever go to Oshkosh, the airport there is named Whitman Field after Steve because he was later airport manager. And actually, the airplane in the upper right, above Bonzo there, is another one of his racers. That was a Formula One racer he had, also named Bonzo. And that was kind of an all-conquering Formula One racer that he designed in the 1940s. And once again, the concept was a very tight, clean design. The ultimate racer was Howard Hughes's H1 racer there, designed by Dick Palmer at the Grand Central Air Terminal. And it was unveiled in 1935. It's all metal. If I remember right, one of the wings, there were two different wings you could have on it. One was for closed circuit racing, and one was for the Bendix Trophy race. So the Bendix wing was a longer span. And if I remember right, one of them was wood, the other was metal. But otherwise, you can see the fuselage is gorgeous. It's all metal. And powered 825 horsepower. It's not a monstrous engine. And he ended up setting a world speed record of 352 miles an hour with it. And probably could have done very well in national air races. But once again, he was discouraged from racing because they didn't want people just coming in and buying the trophy, as they said. Despite the fact, really, Howard Hughes made some very significant advances in aerodynamic technology here that would have been good to have shown in the race. You can also see the NACA cowling he's got there, very clean, tight cowling on the aircraft. And of course, this is the National Air and Space Museum on the Mall in DC also. Amazing what's in that museum. And actually, in the upper left there, you get that red airplane you see a little bit of is another Steve Whitman racer. That's Buster, which was also a Formula One racer that he and another fellow campaigned through the 40s and 50s and were very successful with. So the influence on modern designs, that's a 737-800, if I remember. Yeah, 800. And you can see, Boeing aircraft, with the exception of the 787 and now the 777X for the wing, all the other Boeings are aluminum stress skin monocoque fuselage and wings. And in some cases, some composite tail parts, other cases not. And that really was technology that was originally pioneered, well, really by Dornier, and developed further over the years, including by de Havilland when they did the Comet, things like that. The Mooney M10 down in the lower right, which unfortunately is now kind of a rare one-off airplane. It was supposed to be a training airplane. At the time this presentation was put together, it had just flown. It's an example of an integrated radiator installation. That's actually got a liquid-cooled diesel engine in it. And they have a very well-done integrated cooling system that is low drag. Unfortunately, the airplane had some issues and they didn't have the time and the money to develop it, and this program got canceled. But it's a very pretty airplane. And the airplane actually still exists. It's in the hangars down at Caryville in Texas. So anyways, where to see them? Now, obviously, I've touched on some of these as we've gone along. And as I noted, the Jimmy Doolittle's Curtiss is the National Air and Space Museum in DC. The Italian Air Force Museum in Italy, right outside of Rome, has the Mach-E M39 and the MC-72. Just a quick note, the MC stands for Mach-E Castaldi. Castaldi was the designer that they allowed his name to be appended to Mach-E's for the design. And when he retired, Bazooki took over, and that's why later Mach-E's are MB. And then Bazooki retired in the 90s, I can't remember exactly when. And actually gave a seminar in an AIAA meeting I was at. Very interesting hearing him talk about these designs. So anyways, those two museums are in those two aircraft are in a museum outside of Rome. If you want to see them, be organized ahead of time. I thought I could just get a taxi out there. Driver wanted $235, so I never got out there. So be organized. I wish I was. The airplane in the lower right, of course, is the Supermarine S6B. The S6A also still exists. It's in Southampton. And as I noted, the S6B is in the Science Museum in London. It's right by Hyde Park, if I remember right. In fact, I got to see it because my wife wanted to walk in Hyde Park, and it started raining. And I said, well, there's a place over here I know we can go, and it's got cool stuff in it. And that's how I finally got into the Science Museum. So there's a good trick. If you want to see a Traveler Mystery R, there's the Frank Hawks is actually still in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. And so that's original. The one I showed earlier is a replica in Kalamazoo, and I think they also showed the replica of Jim Youngin's. So there's a number of replicas of the Mystery R kicking around. The Model Z, as I said, got destroyed, but there's been numerous replicas. Museum of Flight has one. Fantasy of Flight down in Florida has one. Of the GBs, there's a replica at the New England Air Museum that was actually built off original plans that the Granville family allowed them to get access to. There was a replica built by Steve Wolf down in Oregon, you see in the lower right there, of the R2, which is the same as the R1, except with a smaller engine. The R1 has got a R1340, while the R2 has got an R985, like in a Beaver. And that replica was actually flown by a number of years by Delmar Benjamin on the air show circuit. And Delmar put on an incredible show with the airplane, flying inverted. He flew pylon laps at Reno, everything with it. And then finally retired it to the Fantasy of Flight. So Kermit Weeks Museum there in Florida, which is really worth going to. Though I think it's closed right now. I think he's renovating it for a reopening. Other ones, the GB QED was actually built from the MacRobertson race in 1934. And what you see there is a more or less replica that was built by Jim Moss down in Auburn. And at times it's at the Historic Flight Foundation in Payne Field. Down below in the lower right is the Hall Bulldog. There's a replica under construction in the North Cascades Air Museum, which unfortunately is closed now. And I'm not certain where the replica is, but it was under construction. And it was actually Bob Hall designed the original, and his son actually was helping support the construction of the replica. As I noted, the Hughes H-1 is a National Air and Space Museum, And then there's a racer lower right there. The fellow Crosby was a experimental test pilot in the Los Angeles area, and eventually worked for Northrop, and unfortunately was killed in a crash working for Northrop. But his CR4 racer from the Thompson Trophy races is in the EA Museum in Oshkosh, and it's a gorgeous airplane. Benny Howard built a series of racers. Mike, Ike, and I'm drawing a blank. There was a third one. I can't remember what it was, other than Mr. Mulligan. And they actually still exist. There's a corporate pilot in Ohio, if I remember right, who actually owns good chunks of the wreckage and the engine and stuff and is rebuilding them. But for the time being, there's a replica of Mike in the Port Townsend Aero Museum, and there's a replica of Ike in the Fantasy of Flight Museum in, once again, Kermit Weeks' museum down in Florida. And I think there's other replicas of those under construction in various places. In the lower left there is the Chester Jeep Special, once again a Thompson Trophy racer built by Art Chester, who was a pilot. I think he was a Northrop test pilot also, if I remember right. And that's now in the EA Museum. And then that's a GBE replica that's in the Evergreen Air Museum down in Minville. And GB, besides building the Z, the R1, and the R2, built other series of what you call Sportster type aircraft, the A, the E, etc. And there's been numerous replicas of those built over the years. Of the Weedle Williams racers, the original of Rescue Turners, right there, the gold one, still exists in Cleveland at the Crawford Museum. And then the Louisiana State Museum has 3 replicas that were built more recently. The Laird Solution is in the New England Air Museum, Windsor Locks. And the Super Solution, which won the Bendix race with Jimmy Doolittle at the controls, there's a replica of it, which I think incorporates some parts of the real one, if I remember right. It's in the EA Museum in Oshkosh, a really pretty airplane. And then, of course, the Whitman D12 Bonzo, lower right, is almost right next to the Super Solution in the EA Museum. And, of course, Steve Whitman donated directly to the museum himself. The Laird Turner Meteor is out at the Udvar Hazy Center. And if you ever fly in or out of Dulles, you can actually catch a bus over to the other side of the field to get to see Udvar Hazy, but allow a lot of time. There's a lot to see in that museum. And also Tom Wathen had a replica built out of Flaybob down at Riverside. And then, of course, Tom Wathen had a replica of the Caudron built, and a replica of Mr. Mulligan, and a replica of the DH-88 Comet. And then, of course, the originals of the Comet still exist. And there have been other replicas, as I noted, of Mr. Mulligan that have been built over the years. And then a couple others. There's the Keith Ryder R3 from the from the Thompson Trophy races, which is in the New England Air Museum, appropriately with its Pratt & Whitney engine. The Keith Ryder R4. Now, Keith Ryder worked for Douglas Aircraft, and he moonlighted building racing airplanes. So the R4, there's a replica that was built by Tom Wathen that you see there on the right. There's actually the real one is nearby at the Planes of Fame Museum. And actually, look in the lower right corner there, picture in the lower right corner of it. That is the tail of the real one, which is at the Planes of Fame Museum. I actually shot those 2 photos the same day, and by the time I got to Planes of Fame, I thought, oh, it's just another replica. Why do I need to photograph it? Well, it's the real thing, I later found out. Keith Ryder R5, the next in the series, is at the EA Museum in Oshkosh, and then the R6, the 8-ball, as it was so-called, is at the Planes of Fame Museum in Chino, with, of course, the R4. So that's an overview of the National Air Races, the aircraft that were flown in them, and the aeronautical advances that accompanied them and how they went on with time. And hope you've enjoyed the talk. And if anybody has any questions, please let me know. Thank you.